On September 4th, 2024, the U.S. Justice Department indicted 2 RT employees for covertly funding a U.S. company accused of pushing pro-Russia narratives to an American audience. The company in question was Tenet Media, which had been co-founded by prominent far-right commentator and Blaze TV contributor Lauren Chen and her husband. Implicated in the scheme were several other online right-wing talking heads, including Benny Johnson, Lauren Southern, and the notorious BALD, Tim Pool. There, you gotta insert the clip of Tim Pool saying, "I just opine on the news and I get a lot wrong."
Look, I read the news and I opine on it, and I'm wrong about a lot.
While Chen's complicity in accepting foreign funds to run the company appears to be quite explicit, it's possible that these other pundits were unaware of the source of their paychecks. Perhaps Tim Pool thought that the podcast clips he posted on Tenet's YouTube channel, getting less than 10,000 views, were simply worth the $100,000 he received every week. For obvious reasons, this whole thing was a blow to the credibility of everyone involved. Suddenly, all the deranged things that Pool and his peers had said about Ukraine had a pretty simple explanation. Rather than being free thinkers, these commentators may have actually been the worst thing one could be online: grifters. The G word gets thrown around a lot and suggests that the person in question is little more than a snake oil merchant, chasing clicks rather than sharing the truth with their audiences. In the world of network news, the label has been applied to hosts like Tucker Carlson, but to some extent, it's expected that the people in mainstream news are playing a role. I mean, they're reading off a teleprompter, and the only true thing that Bill O'Reilly ever taught me was that the anchor doesn't write what goes on that thing. Where the accusation of being a grifter really matters is online, where we're all supposed to be our real, authentic selves. And for this reason, the griftosphere truly thrives among the right-wing alternative media weirdos that live in my computer. This was exposed in no uncertain terms in 2018 when YouTuber Blair White claimed that many commentators in the right-wing media space were grifters. She would later claim that one of the people she referred to here was the alleged workplace abuser and confirmed debate dodger Steven Crowder, who has been completely unaffected by the accusation in the years since. But perhaps no one has been on the receiving end of the grifter label more than the subject of today's video, everyone's favorite classical liberal, David Joshua Rubin. Before he was also outed as a recipient of Russian funds in the DOJ's indictment, Dave got to start doing some of the worst stand-up comedy you've ever seen in your life.
I feel like that would, if you read a lot, you'd become bisexual. Like, you just keep reading, and then one day you get, I don't know, some words, and then... Okay, very good. We got some good gay guys right here. That I can tell. Gay. Yeah, well, it's cool.
Somehow, he was able to leverage this into some talk show gigs before securing his own program, The Rubin Report, on the liberal Young Turks network. Within a few years, he would take his show independent. As he did so, he took on one of the most annoying gimmicks I have ever seen in online politics. Dave became an ideas guy. He and his guests would just constantly pat each other on the back and congratulate themselves on their ability to share ideas and to disagree with each other, even though they rarely seemed to do much of the latter. Dave took constant pains to remind his audience that he was a liberal, but would almost exclusively invite right-wing and disaffected left-wing guests on his show to whine about the excesses of the modern progressive movement that had scared him away. Within a few years, he would very publicly leave the left through a PragerU video that has now been watched over 16 million times. In the 7 years since, his guest list and his coverage of contemporary politics have continued to move rightward until he found himself providing full-throated endorsements of Donald Trump in both 2020 and 2024. There's an entire cottage industry of people dunking on this guy's show. It's incredible.
Brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Hit us again. Come on, go.
I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
When did he say that? Was that recent?
But this video is not about Dave's sycophantic talk show. It's about the sycophantic book he released in 2018. After watching so many clips online of Dave embarrassing himself over the years and being called a grifter, I decided that I needed to read his book to fully understand him. Is he truly a fraud? Or is he just a right-wing ideologue who had been persuaded by the power of big ideas? So in between videos talking about my true passion, which is US covert operations during the Cold War, I thought it could be fun to take on some light work here and look back at Dave's first venture as an author, which he aptly titled, Don't Burn This Book. The book has 10 chapters altogether. The first 2 largely focus on his personal journey from a self-proclaimed lifelong lefty to the partisan Republican he has come to be today. I'll talk about his personal journey near the end when we try to make sense of who Dave is as a person, whether his beliefs are genuine, and how we should judge him. But before we get there, I want to focus on Dave's actual arguments. The 3rd chapter of this book is called Think Freely or Die. In it, he lays out his positions on all the contentious issues of the day. I'm going to spend most of the video talking about this chapter because that's where the bulk of the book's ideas are. And if there's one thing this book is about, it's ideas. He tells us so at the start of chapter 2 when he writes,
"That's right, people. I want you to walk into a bar and order yourselves a full-bodied opinion. I want you to get absolutely wasted on facts until 3 a.m. And then, when you're about ready to pass out, I want you to get another large glass of reality and chug it. I then want you to have intellectual binges that are so wild you go missing for days, eventually waking up on a stranger's sofa, hungover on reality."
I cannot stress enough that the entire book is written in this tone, and I suffered deep psychic damage because of it. Now, as I go through this, I want to be clear that in responding to Dave's points here, I'm not necessarily always trying to completely debunk him. I'll mostly be focusing on why his arguments are really bad or miss important points. So for each position Dave lays out, I will spend about 5 minutes explaining why I think his arguments are total straw men. I'll be saving the best for last and covering Dave's thoughts on the economy at the very end. This one will be much longer than 5 minutes because it explains why he's so consistently wrong throughout the book. Let's enter Dave Rubin's marketplace of ideas and figure out if this book is truly worth burning. We're going to start off with a topic that I was genuinely interested to hear Dave's take on: drugs. If it's not clear by now, I do not have the highest regard for Dave's intellectual capabilities, but I did think he did a better job than I expected at getting at the heart of the fundamental contradiction in his ideology when discussing this. You see, Dave is a classical liberal, meaning that his ultimate priority is maximizing freedom. One would then think that Dave should support total drug decriminalization, as people can make their own decisions on what to put in their own body. At first, this seems to be exactly what he believes when he writes that
people should be free to decide their own drug intake without risking being locked up.
He reaffirms his position, saying,
adults should be free to consume whatever they want, whenever they want, as long as there are no consequences for other people.
But this last part poses a problem. There are consequences for other people. He says that his libertarian view collapses once we consider Schedule 1 drugs, which include the nasty stuff that will ruin your life, like heroin or meth. Dave says that although he believes in the principle of people being allowed to do whatever they want, the case of drugs can be problematic because many people would feel less free in a society where crackheads roam the street. Here, he's touching on the concept of positive versus negative freedoms. The idea is that the state can sometimes intervene to make society less free in one way in order to make it more free in another. It's an important nuance that Dave will absolutely not return to throughout this book. But he did so here, and I was genuinely proud of him. However, this puts him in an awkward position, because this is the chapter where Dave has promised to lay out his positions on things. So he has to resolve this contradiction somehow. And whatever he chose would likely alienate at least some part of his audience. The more traditional conservatives would hate to see Dave let these addicts turn America into gruesome Gavin's Democratic Republic of California, while his libertarian audience would begrudge him for calling on the state to police the private behavior of its citizens.
Requiring a license to make toast in your own damn toaster.
I was extremely invested in seeing how he would resolve this, but rather than decide one way or the other, Dave simply says that the federal government should remove all restrictions and kick the issue back to the states to decide how to handle it. Some can implement harsher laws, and others can allow their citizens to do what they want. I'd really like to emphasize that Dave opened this chapter by saying,
I would rather be defined by what I support than what I oppose. Hence, I'm dedicating the next few pages to spell this out, issue by issue, in straight-talking detail.
Then on the very first issue, he doesn't actually stake out a position. Because make no mistake, kicking it back to the states is not a position. Just like saying the federal government should decide is not an actual position. You're supposed to tell me what you think they should do, Dave. That's what this chapter is. If you don't know, don't put it in the book. Or at least don't lead with it. My God, who edited this thing? Despite Dave not digging into this thing at all, it is possible for the state to decriminalize drugs to great effect. Portugal did it when they had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. By focusing on treatment rather than incarceration as a response, they were able to reduce their heroin addict population from 100,000 to 25,000 in less than 20 years and achieve the lowest drug-related death rate in Europe at a relatively small cost. The associated programs cost the average taxpayer just $10 per year, saving them 18% on what they would have otherwise spent on healthcare and legal costs for users. The only reason the program ultimately collapsed was that the country hit hard financial times and slashed the budget for drug treatment from $82 million to $17.4 million. Although the addict situation in Portugal is nowhere near as bad as it had been, it has absolutely deteriorated since the program was running as intended. Not only is this story interesting, it's borderline essential to our understanding of tackling drug addiction. A Western country decriminalized drugs at the federal level. Whether it worked or not, that's where our understanding of effective policy prescriptions should start. But Dave can't talk about it for reasons that I will make clear when we talk about the economy later. So to summarize, our first policy position from Dave is that someone else should decide the policy. Awesome stuff. Let's see what he has to say about immigration. Similar to the section on drugs, I knew going into this that there is a contradiction at the heart of Dave's ideology in regards to immigration. He constantly harps on freedom as the core tenet of classical liberalism, which would seem to suggest that he should support the freedom of movement for people. But he is also a partisan Republican with an audience of partisan Republicans. This means that the vast majority of them likely see immigrants and refugees as an important threat to America, or that they are poisoning the blood of America. Not to worry, Dave makes it very clear where he stands right out of the gate on this one. Sort of. The section begins with Dave writing,
I wouldn't dream of getting off a flight into another country, swaggering up to the immigration officer, and demanding permanent residency. This would make me an entitled buffoon who fulfills all the cliches of a brash, vulgar American. Therefore, it doesn't take a genius to understand that they'd be entirely justified in turning me away without being branded racist, far-right xenophobes who suffer from fragility of whatever sort. This, dear reader, is precisely why I believe in nation-states.
That's right, folks, don't cancel him now, but Dave believes that borders should exist. You liberal communist yuppies probably want to burn this book because of all this common sense conservatism, but Dave's not afraid to speak this hard truth. And you know what? I expected him to take this point and run with it by suggesting that the woke demon rats were for open borders, but he actually tries to make a point in a far stranger and incompetent manner. In his quest to prove that supporting the existence of a border is not a far-right racist position, he quotes multiple prominent Democrats who have denounced illegal immigration over the years. This included Obama in 2005.
We are a generous and welcoming people here in the United States, but those who enter the country illegally and those who employ them disrespect the rule of law. And they are showing disregard for those who are following the law. We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked, and circumventing the line of people who are waiting patiently, diligently, and lawfully to become immigrants in this country.
In 2013, in his State of the Union address,
real reform means stronger border security, and we can build on the progress my administration's already made, putting more boots on the southern border than at any time in our history, and reducing illegal crossings to their lowest levels in 40 years. Real reform means establishing a responsible pathway to earn citizenship, a path that includes passing a background check, paying taxes and a meaningful penalty, learning English, and going to the back of the line behind the folks trying to come here legally.
As well as Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi at a Georgetown University speech in 2009.
Illegal immigration is wrong, plain and simple. Until the American people are convinced that we will stop future flows of illegal immigration, we will make no progress on dealing with the millions of illegal immigrants who are here now and on rationalizing our system of legal immigration. It's plain and simple and unavoidable.
He brings this up in service of trying to show that Trump's rhetoric around the border is not racist, writing,
Boy, these people are seriously racist, according to their own self-proclaimed standards of today. Despite this hypocrisy, I will actually defend them as they throw their former selves under the bus.
And this betrays a fundamental problem with so many of the arguments that Dave makes in this book. If Dave's position is that borders are good and that it isn't racist to say so, and then quotes pretty much every high-level Democrat agreeing with him that illegal immigration is bad, who precisely are we mad at then? Why is he suggesting that people would think that believing in borders is racist? It's clearly not Republicans, but it doesn't seem to be Democrats either. Is it just woke people on Twitter? That'd be a weird thing to write a book about, but at least tell me who's saying this to you. It would make the argument much easier to follow. Because without context, it just seems like everyone agrees with Dave's hot take that nations are real. But obviously what Dave is trying to drive at here is not that everyone is on the same page, but rather that attacks from the Democrats on Trump's border policy are disingenuous because they largely believe the same things as him. And the weird thing is that I believe he's right in a way. Democrats are hypocrites when it comes to the border. During a town hall, Kamala Harris suggested that she would build the wall more effectively than Trump did, 8 years after he made it a major plank of his campaign.
Trump said Mexico would pay for it? Come on, they didn't. How much of that wall did he build? I think the last number I saw is about 2%.
But you do want to build some wall.
I want to strengthen our border.
So there's a kernel of truth here, but what Dave misses is that Trump was not attacked because he thought that borders should exist. He was criticized for saying and doing things far worse than that. Yale historian Greg Grandin summarized Trump's position on the border as follows.
It was the focus on the border and all that went with it, labeling Mexicans rapists, calling migrants snakes and animals, stirring up anger at undocumented residents, proposing to end birthright citizenship, unleashing ICE agents to raid deep into the country, to stalk schools and hospitals, to split families and spread grief, that provided Trumpism its most compelling through-line message. The world's horizon is not limitless. Not all can share in its wealth, and the nation's policies should reflect that reality.
The idea that a country's resources are limited and not everyone can share in them is one that Dave makes as well, and maybe it is valid. It's one that the Democrats seem to be making when Dave quotes them. It's likely the reason that Kamala Harris was telling Central Americans not to come to the border and has made securing the border part of her 2024 presidential campaign.
To be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border, do not come. Do not come.
But it's not usually this pragmatic case against unlimited immigration that people label racist or far right. Not usually, anyway. It's the cruelty that bothers people. When the border truly started becoming a mainstream political issue nearly 100 years ago, the cause was spearheaded by white supremacists seeking race vigilantism. That's the racist part. Nowadays, Trump has consistently called migrants at the southern border animals, and the border police have treated them as such. For example, a bipartisan Senate report found that female immigrants at a private detention center, quote, were subjected to excessive, invasive, and often unnecessary gynecological procedures, and that the Department of Homeland Security knew that the medical care provided was deficient, but that ICE still made no attempt to fix this. That's the racist part. And the issue here is not just about race, it's about freedom too, which is Dave's #1 priority. You see, federal agents are provided, quote, extra constitutional powers within 100 miles of international borders. But the definition of the border has been stretched to apply to immigration posts in airports. This means that these border zones with special powers cover 200 million US citizens. It includes the entirety of Michigan, Hawaii, and Florida. If you live in these areas, and 75% of America's Latino population does, border patrollers can seize your vehicle, conduct inspections, or demand your papers. The Constitution does not apply. Call this what you want, but it ain't freedom. And Democrats are not innocent in building this system, so Dave is close to correct when he alludes to a degree of hypocrisy in their criticism of Trump's border policies, because brutality at the US southern border is long-standing and consistent between both parties. But once again, Dave does not get to the heart of the problem here. He does not take a moment to ask why so many people are turning up at the southern border and why they keep getting in. And he can't do that for reasons I will explain when we talk about the economy later. Next up is abortion. This section is extremely short, but it is interesting. Not because Dave makes any compelling arguments, because he doesn't. It's interesting because I think his take on this reveals something about himself. Dave writes that as a lifelong liberal, he had always been pro-choice, believing that terminating a pregnancy should be safe and rare, the latter of which is important to remember. As he learned more about gestation and the leftist fetishization of abortion, he started calling himself begrudgingly pro-choice. Part of what pushed him to this point was seeing YouTube videos of women celebrating their abortions and organizations like Shout Your Abortion, which Dave says encourages women to proudly announce their abortions online.
I'ma have abortions always.
He then responds to one woman's testimonial by saying that she chose to, quote, end a life, and suggesting that another had, quote, executed her fetus. Dave simply says that through looking into surrogacy with his husband, who is named David by the way, doctors had taught him that life begins when sperm fertilizes the egg. He then immediately follows this up by saying that he still believes in a woman's right to abortion and they should still be safe and rare. Which, to be clear, Dave thinks is murder. Perhaps even more so nowadays, as he has repeatedly tweeted about how Elizabeth Warren's support for protecting abortion rights means she wants to kill babies. So how can he rationalize this? How can he think that abortion is murder, but still support it? The answer is simple. Dave can't support criminalizing abortion because he may need one someday. You see, Dave and David were going through the surrogacy process at the time of writing this book, which was eventually successful in 2022, drawing the ire of his conservative audience. He writes that had they found out that the baby was going to be physically or mentally disabled and caught it early enough, they would, quote, terminate the pregnancy. It's worth noting that when other women get abortions, they are ending lives or carrying out executions, but when Dave does it, it's terminating a pregnancy. This is one of those rare times where Dave makes it explicitly clear that his politics largely revolve around his own personal interests, but we'll dig into that later. He goes on to say that he supports abortion up to 12 weeks to balance the freedom of the mother and the right to life of the baby. He used to support it up until 5 months when the fetus can feel pain, but he lowered it when he learned that 20 to 35% of babies born after 24 weeks survive, and 20 weeks is just too close to that. That said, Dave does believe in exceptions after that for when the fetus or the mother's life are in jeopardy, or if severe abnormalities will affect its life in the long term. He says that terminating a pregnancy as late as 7 or 8 months is a clear act of violence. So ultimately, Dave's position on abortion is that it should be legal for the first 12 weeks. I imagine this is a pretty normal position to have in America, but the framing of this chapter just kills me. Dave knows full well that his audience is right-wing, so instead of this being a chapter about why keeping abortion around is good at a time when abortion rights were under attack from the right, he instead focuses on why the left is crazy about abortion. He suggests that abortion should be safe and rare and takes issue with social justice groups seemingly encouraging women to get abortions, but neglects to mention that at the time this book was written, the abortion rate had been declining among women of all age groups since 2011. The numbers dating back to 1973 are even more stark, indicating that the number of legal abortions in America peaked in 1990 with 1.6 million, but by 2020 had dropped to just 930,000. This would appear to suggest that perhaps the loony left has not convinced women to have abortions more often, and that they were actually more rare, which is what Dave should love. Now, if this is the case, it would then seem odd that groups like Shout Your Abortion would seek to have women talk up abortion so much. But the reason groups like this exist is not to convince women to have abortion, it's to destigmatize abortion. We know that among women who do get them, the vast majority do not regret their decision, but many still feel as though they will be judged for getting one, which makes their decision more difficult or delays it. Activist groups like this are hoping to allow women to feel more comfortable making a decision they were already going to make anyway, one that they don't tend to regret. If their purpose was to convince women to get more abortions, they've been failing miserably. But there is one thing that increased the number of abortions taking place in America: the overturning of Roe v. Wade. In the first calendar year since Roe v. Wade was overturned, there was an 11% increase in abortions since 2020, making it the highest number and rate in over 10 years. So even on Dave's terms, where abortion should be safe and rare, it is the right that is throwing a wrench into things, not the left. But Dave can't talk about how this blatantly undemocratic decision harms women for reasons that I will explain when we talk about the economy. Next up is trans rights. Dave immediately opens up the chapter by saying that when he was a kid, he wanted to be a Decepticon named Soundwave, which tells me that we will be approaching this issue with exactly the kind of maturity I expected. Now, in his defense, he follows this up by saying that,
alright, maybe I'm being a little snarky, but the only way I can think of getting into the whole transgender debate is with a little humor. The only other option might be to encourage compassion for trans people and their struggle for dignity, but I would hope this already goes without saying.
The back half of this is unironically the most pro-trans thing I have seen a conservative say in a long time, and he almost certainly wouldn't have written this if the book was released today. He then says that the classical liberal stance on trans issues is that everyone should be allowed to modify their body as they see fit, which is again pretty woke by conservative standards these days. But he makes sure to italicize this next bit, but only when they're an adult. And this is how Dave manages to shift the conversation from being supportive of trans rights to throwing red meat to his audience again. He says that, quote, "We're allowing record numbers of young children, some as young as 4 years old, to change their gender through invasive surgery and potent puberty blockers. It should go without saying that this does not happen for obvious reasons. When you are 4 years old, trans or not, there is generally no need to take puberty blockers because there is no puberty to block. You are probably 8 years short of needing these things. If a 4-year-old has been prescribed puberty blockers, it's not because they're trans, it's because they're experiencing puberty far too early. For similar reasons, 4-year-olds are not getting sexual reassignment surgery. A 4-year-old who is born female does not require a double mastectomy because there are no breasts to remove. And you wouldn't do bottom surgery on a toddler because there is never any need to do bottom surgery on a toddler. So after a strong start, we are back to nonsensical right-wing talking points. Dave supports his argument by saying that even many trans people agree with his position. And sure enough, his source is former guest on the Rubin Report, Blair White. I don't have time to get into who Blair is or what her deal is, but as a right-wing friend of Alex Jones, I think it's fair to say her takes on trans issues are far from representative of the trans community at large. Dave continues on by saying that transitioning the youth is bad because a trans woman's vaginal depth will be determined by the size of their penis. This means they need to go through puberty to produce enough tissue to create the vagina. He also stresses that trans people tend to become sterile, which is something that people can't appreciate as a child. But the argument that I really want to highlight here is the one Dave makes around detransitioning. He says that according to the US Transgender Survey from 2015, 8% of the 28,000 participants detransitioned, which leads him to conclude that, quote, "the grass isn't always greener." And I knew as soon as I read this that Dave was playing games. I didn't think he was lying about this figure, but I would have bet my entire soul that he was leaving out some important context. And sure enough, that's exactly what he did. The authors of the paper wrote,
8% of respondents reported having detransitioned at some point.
So points to Dave for getting that right. But the very next sentence is, quote, most of those who detransitioned did so only temporarily. 62% of those who detransitioned reported that they were currently living full-time in a gender different than the gender they were thought to be at birth. And this feels a little important, doesn't it? Not only is an 8% detransition rate quite low, but well over half of them retransition. If Dave read this paper, and I'm almost certain that he did not, because it's 300 pages long, he could not possibly, in good conscience, cite this stat without this context. But perhaps even more importantly, he leaves out why people detransition. Only 5% indicated they did so because transitioning just wasn't for them. Not 5% of the sample, 5% of the 8%. That is 0.4% of the entire sample. This means that of the 27,715 participants in this study, about 111 of them later decided that transitioning just wasn't for them. That is a shockingly low number of people. I'll list the most common reasons for detransitioning on screen here with the corresponding percentages, but you'll notice very quickly that the biggest factor at play here is pressure from family, friends, partners, and employers. These all play into the major themes identified by the researchers, mainly that trans people are largely mistreated and discriminated against in America and require the support of their community in order to lead fulfilling lives. The fact that they wrote 300 pages about this, and Dave simply condensed all of that down to a misrepresented statistic, and the grass isn't always greener, is so cynical it disgusts me. Surely his take on feminism and the wage gap will be more thoughtful. Nah, I'm just fooling. This shit sucks. Dave calls this section the war on women and starts it off by saying women are not oppressed and that they are actually freer than ever. He says that women are more likely to go to university in America than they are in over 100 other countries. They are less likely to be murdered than men, which is true in many cases, but becomes a little bit more complicated when you start factoring in the race of the victim into the analysis. But sure, Dave. He also says women are less likely than men to be victims of every crime except for rape and sexual assault, which seem like pretty big ones to me. Dave says that actually men appear to be more oppressed than women, as men are more likely to be in prison and receive harsher sentences than women for the same crimes. Women also live longer, win their custody battles more, and pay less in taxes and receive more benefits from the state. He follows this up by covering the wage gap. Dave says that it just doesn't exist. This idea that women make 79 cents for every dollar a man makes is based on comparing median earnings between working men and working women without controlling for things like job type, experience, and hours worked. He tells us that women tend to pursue jobs that pay less than men, that they are more likely to leave jobs when starting a family. And I thought this was a time for some introspection on Dave's part, but the chapter just stops there. He ends by saying that sometimes disparities aren't caused by discrimination and that it's just based on life choices, which is good unless you crave victimhood. Now I'll go through the wage gap first, then I can speak to the general state of women in society and whether they are oppressed. On the wage gap, Dave is right that when we control for other variables, the gap closes from 79 cents to something like 91 cents, which is still a pretty significant gap. And he attributes this to the choices that women make due to personality differences and child rearing. But some, like economist Matt Brunig, have argued that controlling for these variables isn't necessarily the right thing to do, given that a labor market which rewards men's jobs more than women's jobs is still sexist, just in a different way. His analysis indicated that when we compare the median woman to the median man and include non-workers, women make just 60% of what men make, which is far worse. The reason for this is that many women exit the workforce after having kids. Dave kinda comes close to acknowledging this gap towards the end of the section when he argues that women actually make more than men before having kids. He thinks this is a point in his favor, but I think it's exactly the opposite. Does this not show the sexism at the heart of this? That giving birth is one of the largest factors influencing the pay gap? That women do 75% of the unpaid care work that is essential to keeping our world chugging along and suffer economically for it? This seems like something that Dave should have to contend with, but he just moves on to the next section. And there's a reason he can't talk about rectifying this disparity, and I'll make sense of it when we talk about the economy. Now, on the general state of women in America, Dave paints a very rosy picture. He lists all of the ways that women have it better than men. It's true they're less likely to get murdered or die on the job. But the problem is that these things weren't really in dispute. The feminist case for why the world isn't the best for women is not that men have it better in every conceivable category. They don't. In fact, the feminist case can be pretty specific, and Dave deals with none of it. If I had the opportunity to sit down with Dave to talk politics, as soon as I was done giving him a wedgie, I would explain to him that part of the feminist critique of modern society is that we generally live in a world built by men for men. A good book on this is Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. She opens the book up by talking about a town in Sweden clearing snow off the roadways before they cleared up sidewalks and bike paths. This seemed like an innocuous decision on its face, but it turns out that pretty much everywhere you look, men are more likely to drive and women are more likely to walk or take public transit. The result was that when it snows, it was disproportionately women who ended up falling, breaking bones, and going to the hospital. Meanwhile, drivers were largely able to navigate the snow until it was cleared with minimal injuries. By clearing the walkways first, they were able to reduce harm to women and actually save money on the associated medical costs. Now that's one way that women can be harmed by male-centric policymaking. Another factor to consider is domestic violence and sexual assault. As of 2019, around the time when Dave's book came out, there were still 17 states in America that didn't allow for spouses to be convicted of rape if their partner was drugged, incapacitated, or unconscious during the act, which is to say that for millions of women in America, being raped under certain circumstances was effectively not a crime. Similarly, it wasn't until 2022, after Dave's book was written, that police officers in America were no longer allowed to sexually assault women in custody and claim it was consensual as a defense. There are plenty of ways that the economy and the legal system can have biases against women, and hell, I'll throw Dave a bone and say men too. It is fucked up that men die at work so much. But again, we can't understand why he can't get into these problems or their solutions until we talk about the economy. Next up is systemic racism. Dave starts us off with some really good news, that America is less racist than it has ever been before. He cites a survey showing that people are more in favor of school integration and interracial marriage. He also cites research showing that both conscious and unconscious racial bias have declined significantly. He then goes over some research showing that black people are less likely to be shot by police when you control for their overrepresentation in police interactions. Although they are still overrepresented as a whole, he explains this is because black people commit more crime than white people do. Then, perhaps because he knows the common response to this is to bring up black poverty, he does so himself by stating that more white children live in poverty than any other race in America. He uses this to suggest that the existence of white privilege is questionable. The problem with this is that the poverty rate would be much more informative than the raw figures. For some perspective, white kids make up 49% of the population, 26% are Hispanic, and 14% are black, indicating that the Latino and black kids are drastically overrepresented here. And I have to say, this is one of the most incoherent sections of the book to me. He could be forgiven for not defining systemic racism if he just used it correctly, but he doesn't, so I'm kind of lost here. Based on what Dave has provided us, one would assume that systemic racism refers to how white people feel about black people, and the result of such systemic racism would be black people being shot by police disproportionately. So if we show that white people don't hate black people, and that cops maybe aren't shooting them as much as we think, then the case is closed. But that's completely wrong. Systemic racism is when a system perpetuates unequal outcomes between races, and the outcomes we look at are not exclusive to police shootings. This kind of discrimination can exist with explicit laws like Jim Crow, or it can carry on with race-blind policies that disproportionately benefit some groups over others. In any case, systemic racism can exist even if interpersonal racism is low and cops are hesitant to shoot black people. Now, if we want to focus on some outcomes of systemic racism, we can see that black people are significantly more likely to be murdered than white people, they're more likely to be in prison, black men receive significantly longer sentences than white men, and black Americans have lower life expectancies than white Americans, though the gap is closing. I bring up these stats specifically because these are the exact ones that Dave used to assert that men are oppressed in the last section. But one can make the case that much like men in general, black men just commit more crime, which could account for the statistical differences I just laid out. But if that's true, we then need to explain why the difference exists. In the case of men versus women, Dave can ignore whatever we know about socialization and just say males are inherently more violent and impulsive than females, and a lot of people will just nod along politely and not really challenge him on this. But when it comes to race, it's different. We can't really lean on that as an explanation, given that pretty much everyone understands that race is a social construct, not a biological one. We know there's more genetic variation within racial categories than there are between them, so there doesn't appear to be any preordained reason for higher black crime and incarceration. And it's not like this crime disparity has always existed either. Until the end of the 60s, the black homicide rate was not higher than the white rate, and prisons were mostly full of white men. And this is where Dave misses the mark on what systemic racism is. Systemic racism is not the outcomes themselves, the outcomes are the symptoms. There is something going on that explains the disparities, but Dave makes no attempt to grapple with this. It's all just dismissed as victimhood. But there's a pretty good explanation for all of this stuff. While black crime and incarceration rates are higher than that of white people in America, the difference is largely driven by class. Once this is accounted for, we can see that race is not a statistically significant predictor of many incarceration outcomes. And make no mistake, the racial class divide is massive. Although the median earnings difference between races is quite large, where white people really start to run away with things is in the wealth gap. Data available through the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescence to Adult Health indicated that the average white family with head ages between 25 and 34 with college degrees had over $50,000 in wealth, while the equivalent black family had just $1,000 in wealth. That is a staggering difference, and this could be attributed in part to the fact that black people tend to occupy housing that is worth a hell of a lot less than that of white people. This can be traced back to redlining and other market-oriented housing policies after World War II that suburbanized American communities based on class, effectively maintaining segregation and creating inner-city ghettos. When gentrification began forcing disproportionately black and Latino people out of those same areas, they ended up living in the suburbs, which are inhospitable to those who don't own a car. Because these poorer communities are less likely to own cars, they are overrepresented among the thousands of pedestrians killed by cars every year. I bring this up because, like I said a few minutes ago, systemic racism is not just about police shootings and prison sentences. It's about the many ways that people of color face unique challenges through the class divide baked into America's economy. And although these issues directly challenge Dave's vision of America as a free, egalitarian country, he can't get into this because acknowledging these problems would necessitate discussing possible solutions, and he can't talk about those for reasons I will explain when we talk about the economy. Next up is foreign policy. Now, Dave lays out his foreign policy takes in Chapter 3 alongside the rest of his positions I've laid out thus far, but then he talks about American imperialism in Chapter 7, which he aptly titled, Stop Hating Straight White Men, America, and Western Values. Because these are technically two separate sections of this book, I'm going to give myself some leeway here and go over my allotted 5 minutes and make this one 10-minute segment because these two things are very much connected. On foreign policy, Dave says that America requires a strong military so that no one messes with them, and that this is the best way to avoid war. To explain why the left does not take on this approach, he writes,
Progressives love to confuse this tactic with being trigger happy, as if it's some display of our toxic masculinity or something, but they simply don't get it.
And I would like to reiterate that although I have been largely shielding you from the really embarrassing way that Dave makes his points using Twitter lingo from 2016, make no mistake, the entire book is like this. Everything is about social justice, pronouns, and toxic masculinity. Dave says that having a strong military threat only works if the threat is credible. So although Dave started the chapter by saying that he wants the military to be feared to avoid more conflict, he also thinks that Obama's biggest foreign policy blunder was not attacking Syria more directly when Assad crossed his red line and used chemical weapons. He then immediately says that he personally always opposed getting involved in Syria, but that once Obama said he had a red line, he should have acted on it. This is one of the worst cases of having your cake and eating it I have ever witnessed in my life. Dave wants a strong military to avoid war, but for a strategy to work, you have to go to war every now and again. Obama shouldn't have gone into Syria on principle, but also he should have, even though Dave would have complained about it if he did. It's completely nonsensical. But what really blew up Dave's credibility on this peace through strength stuff was his thoughts on Ukraine. Dave writes that America must assert themselves in the face of tyranny because no one else will. He says that when Russia invaded Crimea, NATO completely abandoned the Ukrainians, implying that America should have stepped up. Whether he means through direct intervention or through providing funds is unclear to me. But in any case, this is a far cry from where Dave finds himself now. If you pull up Dave's Twitter account and search Ukraine, you will see nothing but posts complaining about how much money they've received from the US. On his show, Dave suggests that the US is sending the money as part of the dreaded Great Reset.
Is the war in Ukraine actually part 2 of the Great Reset plan, part 1 being COVID lockdowns, of course? Yeah, I think so.
One could point out that Dave's turn to calling for an end to Ukraine's aid has something to do with his paychecks coming from Russia, especially in light of him fawning over Russian military propaganda.
This Russian
Army video.
Границы своих возможностей. К черту границы. Ты готов ломать себя? Задача выследить врага.
Now allow me to show you what the U.S. Army put out last week.
Little girl raised by two moms. Finished high school at the top of my class. I found it. A way to prove my inner strength.
We're screwed, people. Can you imagine that Russian guy coming up against that girl? No offense to that girl. But if you give me a, East Village lesbian versus Vladimir Putin, who's gonna win?
But I don't think Russia actually changed his mind on this. Partially because he was saying this stuff before he ever received a dime from Tenet Media, and partially because it's clear from reading this 3-page section of his book that Dave believes in nothing when it comes to foreign policy. He talks out of both sides of his mouth to avoid alienating his neoconservative audience or his isolationist friends. There is nothing resembling analysis in this section. It's completely empty-headed. And honestly, the imperialism stuff might be worse. Dave says that although the left will try to tell you that America is an imperialist country, that's not true. It's actually quite the opposite. The US was, quote, literally founded on a pushback against imperialism. He defines imperialism as, quote, extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force, or other means. Now, even if we accept that the premise of 1776 was a rejection of British imperialism, that tells us nothing about whether America would carry out any imperialism of its own. Just because you don't want a bully stealing your lunch money doesn't mean that you couldn't steal someone else's. Once the US established itself as a republic, it continuously intruded on Native American territory, forcing them west and into increasingly small reserves while butchering and scalping them at every opportunity. Part of the motivation behind expanding westward was to disenfranchise black people who were being emancipated from slavery, which is obviously not unrelated to America's imperialist origins either. But Dave doesn't talk about any of that. Instead, to help explain that America is a force for good in the world, he cites Stanford historian Niall Ferguson, who apparently claimed that America's main purpose is, quote,
to spread free markets, to entrench the rule of law so as to eliminate the mainsprings of terrorism, to impose order, and to pave the way for representative government.
And to be clear, that first bit, to spread free markets, is the imperialism part that people get mad about. Because free markets were not spread for the benefit of the poor countries, which I can explain when we get to the economy. I would even contend with the phrasing of this and say the US does not spread free markets, but rather they forcefully opened up or gave themselves greater access to foreign markets. America did this because they were producing more than they could sell at home. This drive to gain or maintain control over foreign markets was manifested throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries. In 1893, a group of white men, who were mostly sugar plantation owners, overthrew the Queen of Hawaii with the support of the US government to avoid democratic rights being granted to their native workers. America would then annex Hawaii a few years later at the request of the coup plotters. When Cuban rebels were on their way to securing independence from the Spanish, the US invaded under the guise of helping them, only to immediately claim that the Cuban people were incapable of self-governance and essentially ended their independence by installing a completely submissive regime. They also took the Philippines as part of their war with Spain, which they paid $20 million for. The Filipino people would declare war on the US shortly thereafter. President McKinley would later admit that he wanted the Philippines as a means to access Chinese markets rather than to Christianize the country as he originally claimed. Under the leadership of men like Colonel Jacob Smith, who told his men to kill everyone over the age of 10, the US would kill 16,000 guerrilla fighters and over 20,000 Filipino civilians in the process of acquiring the country. After that, the US pushed Panamanian revolutionaries to declare independence from Colombia so they could build the Panama Canal there. When the Colombian government swooped in to oust the small band of rebels, the US arrested their troops and set up a blockade to keep their revolution safe. They would go on to utilize a nearly identical strategy in Honduras when their liberal government took out loans with European banks rather than JP Morgan. What I'm describing here is a not remotely exhaustive list of government overthrows carried out by the US, and it all happened within a 20-year period from 1893 to 1913. The common through line in all of these instances is that these coups were largely spearheaded by private citizens acting in their own interests and ultimately backed by the US government. When the Cold War came around, the character of these operations changed somewhat. Given that they found themselves in a propaganda war with the Soviet Union, Americans could not just place troops on whatever shores they desired without the risk of pushing the Third World further into the hands of the Soviets. Rather than stop intervening in the affairs of the world's poor, the US just got more subtle about it and changed their justifications. Now, they weren't overthrowing governments to line the pockets of 13 white guys. They were also saving those peasants from the threat of Stalinism, even when no such threat existed. The US first tried this strategy with Operation Ajax in Iran in 1953. The democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had positioned the nationalization of Iranian oil as one of his top priorities. This drew the ire of the British, who owned the majority of it and were not interested in giving it up. The Brits would repeatedly appeal to the Americans for aid in coupping him, but it wasn't until 1953, after Eisenhower entered the White House, that they finally acquiesced. Part of their reasoning behind the coup was that the country was at risk of falling into the hands of the Iranian communists, and Mossadegh would not be able to stop them. This analysis seriously overstated their power, however, and seemed to just be cover for the Western imperial interest in Iran's oil. When the CIA ultimately began stoking the flames of political discontent against Mossadegh, he refused to stage an authoritarian crackdown on the rebels, and he fell to a military coup in August. This restored total power to the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The Shah would then maintain his hold on power for over 2 decades through mass murder and torture that was backed to the hilt by the United States. The US would use the Ajax playbook again in Guatemala in 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz had been democratically elected in the hopes that he would pass sweeping land reform to allow the majority Mayan peasants to crawl out of absolute poverty. This land reform plan would draw the ire of the United Fruit Company, who stood to be compensated for the land they would lose, but lobbied Washington to get rid of Arbenz regardless. Part of this campaign against the Social Democratic Arbenz was the accusation that he was a secret communist acting on the behalf of the Soviet Union. While he did appoint communists to government posts, he did so because of their enthusiasm for his land reform program and their support among the peasants who stood to benefit from it. Despite his democratic legitimacy and popular mandate, the CIA would arm and train troops in Honduras and ultimately use psychological warfare to convince the government that the rebels were far more daunting than they really were, leading to Arbenz's resignation and the death of democracy in the country. For the next 2 decades, the government would continually repress the Mayan peasant population on anti-communist grounds. In the late 70s and early 80s, they would carry out one of the largest genocides of the 20th century, killing approximately 200,000 people in a country of under 7 million. While Jimmy Carter had cut off aid to the government when the mass killing ramped up, the CIA simply worked around him to keep propping up the regime. When Reagan came to power, he restored the aid on the grounds that the Guatemalan government, which was throwing people into pits and setting them on fire, was getting a quote, bum rap. And these are not isolated incidents. The US backed this kind of brutality to their own benefit in places like El Salvador, Vietnam, Honduras again, and plenty of others. Even recently, we can see that when the US took control of Iraq, they immediately sought to privatize large swaths of their economy. To suggest that the essence of America's founding does anything to refute the past 150 years of bloodshed carried out in the name of opening markets is entirely ahistorical and would be completely discrediting if this hadn't been preceded by so much other nonsense already. So as we've seen so far, all of Dave's points are either poorly argued or just completely wrong on every level. But why? Why would Dave ignore so much history in making these points? The answer that ties it all together is his unflinching commitment to the idea of the free market. If you know anything about Dave Rubin, you know that he loves the free market. That is his entire thing. One of the most popular clips you'll find of this guy is when he went on Joe Rogan's podcast to advocate against regulations for building houses, which Joe rightfully pointed out was very stupid.
What problem would you, everything you're building here right now, right? Do you want the government to tell you how to do all these things and all the regulations that you got to have your electric thing this far from this and like all
the regulations like that for construction are important though. You do have to make sure that people don't do stupid shit.
Despite having him on multiple times in the past, Rogan never invited Rubin back on again and stopped returning his texts and calls. I know this because Dave has complained about this on multiple occasions.
Will I go on Rogan's podcast? I asked him and our PR people asked him about a bajillion times to go on for my book. We did not get a response as far as I know, so I don't know what happened there.
But you know what? Maybe this wasn't his best showing. Having to defend your ideas live can be a difficult thing, but the case Dave lays out in his book is really not much stronger. When putting together his thoughts on the economy, Dave opens things up by saying he does not support a $15 minimum wage because
when it comes to economic policy, the state should mind its own business and allow people to manage their finances with maximum control. That includes me, you, and everyone else.
He then backs this up with a famous quote from Thomas Sowell saying, quote, "I have never understood why it is greed to want to keep the money you have earned, but not greed to take somebody else's money." Dave adds that we should all be allowed to make as much money as possible and keep the majority of it. Instead, we are currently forced to hand it over to the ever-growing welfare state, which is handled by, quote, "pointless government bureaucrats." But Dave doesn't get down with that. He concedes that we need the government to handle roads, sanitation, and emergency services, but that if he had his way, the government would be cut down by a third. He then lays out his beloved flat tax system, which I think is so sick. Under the Rubin regime, he would reduce the federal tax rate to 18% for everyone. But then, confusingly, says that he would make some exceptions. Those who make under $50,000 would pay 7%, those who make more than $5 million would pay 20%, and those who make under $25K would pay nothing in taxes. This, to me, is one of the funniest things in the book. Dave opens up by saying that the tax system is flat and has continued to talk about how a flat tax system is the only way to do things.
What would be a fair tax plan? Well, the only thing that would be fair is that everyone would be taxed at exactly the same rate, right? So it wouldn't matter if you make $1 million a year or $20 million a year or $100,000 a year, you would have a flat tax. That would be a fair thing. That would be impartial without favoritism, meaning everyone has to pay 10%.
But in the course of laying out how he would design it, he just reinvents progressive taxation. Having a flat tax, then increasing the tax rate for the rich and reducing it for the poor is not a flat tax anymore. It's progressive. It's what America already does. He just reduced the numbers. And I think that what he tells himself is that the exceptions to this flat tax are so small that it doesn't make that much of a difference. And for the $5 million club, he would be right. That is a fraction of a percent. But his system would have 14.1% of Americans paying no income tax and 17.2% paying the 7% rate. Taken together, this is nearly a third of all Americans not paying the flat tax rate. I couldn't believe this when I read it. I don't know how he messed this one up. But Dave's priority is not numbers or definitions. His priority is reducing the taxes that rich people pay. He says that the top 1% pay 90% of federal tax, while the bottom 10% pay nothing. He calls this approach anti-capitalist and a blow to entrepreneurialism. But he's not just worried about taxes. He doesn't want to increase wages for the poor either. He revisits this minimum wage point again and says that a $15 minimum wage would be a win for big companies like Walmart because their smaller competitors wouldn't be able to compete with it. He says that increasing wages will lead to companies like McDonald's leaning more on automation, which will lead to less jobs. He uses this point to transition to his thoughts on Social Security. Dave is not opposed to the social safety net for those who absolutely need it, but he wants it to exist for a limited time with decreasing payments. The idea here is to incentivize people to go back to work, because in Dave's eyes, there are too many people in America who should be working, but are instead just living off of long-term disability. It's very strange to write this for two reasons. The first is that the US largely gutted its social services in the 80s and 90s, and now has below average social spending relative to other OECD countries. The second is that Dave released this book in 2018, when the US was pretty damn close to full employment. It's possible he's talking about the labor participation rate, which is around as low as it was in the 70s, which is not good. According to the Brookings Institute, these figures have dropped because of baby boomers aging out of the workforce, while young people are likely focusing on getting an education and perhaps struggling to find middle-class jobs taken up by the older generations. There appear to be multiple factors at play here, but there's no epidemic of lazy workers sitting around on the government dole. He's just recycling old Reagan talking points. And I mean, Reagan was lying too, but at least he had a robust welfare state to lie about. Dave is just imagining things here. But he has to do that to make his next point in favor of limited government, the dreaded deficit. Dave writes that the US simply cannot afford an expansive welfare state because at the time he wrote this book, they owed $22 trillion in debt. He tells us that this is the highest it has ever been, which is extremely scary, especially because, as Dave reminds us, the US is the richest country in the world. He says that in order to fix it, we simply need to treat this thing like a personal budget. We have to tighten our belts, drive down expenses, and balance that frickin' budget. And this sounds like common sense. But is it true? Or is it possible that maybe the guy who wrote an entire book about how he doesn't like big government is spinning us a yarn to scare us into agreeing with him?
Okay, so we're coming up on that 5-minute mark. Do you want to...
Brother, there's no such thing as 5 minutes anymore. We're past that. We're doing 20 here to make sense of this mess. I'm about to have a breakthrough. Now sit down and record the audio. Audio boy. Now the first thing I want to address here is the way Dave frames government debt. To just say the US has $22 trillion in debt isn't all that informative. Dave tells us this is scary because the US is the richest country in the world, but he has it wrong. That makes it less scary. Think of it this way. If you make $500,000 a year and have $50K in debt, that could be scary, but it's a lot scarier to make $20K a year and have $50K in debt. What matters here is your debt to GDP ratio, how much debt you have relative to how much your economy has. At the time that Dave wrote this book in 2018, the debt to GDP ratio in the US was around 103%. If we look just a few years prior, we can see that the cause of this was the 2008 financial crash, when the government had to inject massive amounts of money to keep the economy afloat while their tax revenues hit the floor. But maybe we agree with Dave here that a debt to GDP ratio of 103% is too high. If that's the case, then surely instituting classical liberal policies and cutting government spending is the solution, right? Well, no, because a government budget does not work like a personal budget. To explain this, I'll show you this quick explainer from former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis. He was asked by the median British male here why the government doesn't just solve their debt issue by cutting their spending. He explained it as follows.
In the country, total expenditure equals total income. In your life, you have a wonderful independence between your expenses and your income. So when you cut down on your expenses, your income doesn't cut. It's not cut. But for the country as a whole, if the country as a whole goes into a major savings spree, then its total income is going to come down. So your personal life is not a good model on which to base the value of the economy.
What he's saying here is that sometimes when the government cuts spending, the country's economy shrinks, and so does government revenue, meaning that their relative debt does not go down, it goes up. This may sound counterintuitive, but it's been borne out time and time again. When Republicans in Congress were considering further cuts to public spending to reduce public debt, they made the mistake of inviting Brown University economist and certified baller Mark Blyth to talk about debt. He explained to them that austerity measures would not solve the issue based on data from the EU.
No one can get enough of this debt. This is an entirely different story. Next slide, please. You can't really see this, but basically what it shows is a regression between the degree of budget tightening, what you want to do on the horizontal axis, and then what happens to your debt. And that dot at the top is Greece, and the ones in the middle are Spain and Ireland and Portugal. And guess what? The more that they tightened, the more debt they got, because the underlying GDP got smaller, and the same constant stock of debt got bigger rather than smaller. So the more you tighten, the more you shrink your economy, the more debt you end up with. It's quite a paradox, but it's a very robust finding. Next slide, please. This is the same thing seen the other way. This is basically the wonders of austerity part 2. The stronger the budget tightening, the sharper the decline in GDP. Again, that's Greece at the bottom. They have cut more than any country in modern history, and they have lost a third of their economy, and their debt has doubled despite the cuts. In fact, because of them.
I understand it can be hard to see exactly what's going on with his slides, but as Blyth says, this is a robust finding. In fact, if we zoom out on the US debt to GDP graph I showed you earlier, you'll see that US debt to GDP nearly doubled during the Reagan administration when he instituted neoliberal economic reforms. When we look at OECD countries at large, we can see that many of the Nordic social democracies, which are known for high levels of social spending, end up near the bottom of the list, while the United States, which constantly pushes austerity, is near the top. This tells me that cutting revenue does not reduce debt necessarily. But hold on a minute, you say. What if lowering taxes stimulates the economy and actually increases government revenue? What an idea, I say back, before ripping your face off Scooby-Doo style to reveal the horrible visage of the former Republican governor of Kansas, Sam Brownback. In 2012, Brownback slashed taxes for business and the ultra-wealthy in a scheme that he directly linked to Reaganomics. He promised that the cuts would bring about renewed prosperity for the state. The theory behind this came from economist Art Laffer, who created the Laffer curve, which is nowhere near as funny as it sounds. The idea behind this thing is that if taxes are zero, the government will have no revenue because it didn't collect anything. But if it taxes at 100%, it will also have no revenue because the economy will be suffocated. The concept is typically represented by a graph that looks like this. The logic behind this has been used to suggest that perhaps a higher tax rate does not always necessarily mean the state will have more tax revenue at their disposal. In fact, it was Art Laffer himself who used this logic to work directly with Brownback to cut taxes in the hopes of boosting the state's economy. And of course, it fucking failed miserably. The state immediately lost $700 million in the first year of the cuts. The public education system saw massive funding cuts, and Brownback became the least popular governor in the country. This stuff is important to bring up because we are constantly told that the economics here are common sense. Cutting spending reduces debt and boosts the economy by unleashing the private sector. It's a nice idea, but it's a lie. Like so much of what I have covered in this book, it's something that sounds straightforward, but completely falls apart when you actually check the facts, something that Dave told me to do in the title of Chapter 5 of his book. But Dave can't help but regurgitate all these talking points because this book is built on the lies and many false promises of the free market. Dave loves the free market. He brings it up constantly on his show and references it multiple times in this book. In Chapter 7, which as I mentioned earlier is called Stop Hating Straight White Men, America, and Western Values, he has a section titled, Yes, Capitalism is Good. In it, he defines capitalism as
an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state.
And he doesn't say it, but a capitalist system can look a lot of different ways, with various degrees to which government can get involved in the economy. For example, the Nordic countries have expansive welfare states, while countries like Singapore have massive amounts of social housing rather than private ones. But Dave collapses it all down into a bit of a binary here. He says that we can either have capitalism, as he defined it just a moment ago, or you can live under a socialist government where bureaucrats ration all the goods and decide what you get. He He frames it this way to push the reader into favoring his free market system. But the problem with this is that the free market is not real. In his book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, liberal economist Ha-Jin Chang writes that free markets are not real. They do not exist. The capitalist system has always required rules and regulation from the government, which can be said to limit the freedom of individual actors in the market. Chang provides the example of child labor. In 1819, British Parliament proposed banning child labor under the age of 9. Children older than that could still work, but at reduced hours. Some MPs opposed the motion on the grounds that this would infringe upon the free market. The logic went that if an employer and a 9-year-old agree to a contract, why should the government be allowed to limit their freedom to do so? The idea of even having this argument today seems insane outside of maybe the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire and behind the closed doors of the red states that are soft launching the reintroduction of child labor. Chang argues that what constitutes freedom in the market isn't an objective measure, it's about your priorities. One could frame this parliamentary debate as being about the freedom of children not to work manual labor when they should be learning, or as the freedom of factory owners to sign contracts to whatever consenting party they choose. Chang also says that nowadays, regulation is everywhere. You can't sell votes, drugs, or your organs. You can't call yourself a doctor, lawyer, or a mortgage broker without certain licensing. But no one really questions these things. He writes that we only notice regulations when we don't endorse the moral values behind them. And this is how we can understand Dave's gripes. The rules and regulations he hates are those that he believes hurt the people that own capital. He doesn't hate the minimum wage because he thinks it hurts workers. He hates it because he thinks it will cost rich people money. He doesn't hate taxes because he wants poor people to get more bang for their buck. He hates them because he wants wealthy people like himself to keep more of their own money. I know this because even if the free market doesn't exist, moving in that general direction with deregulation and government cost cutting does not help the poor, and I can explain why. Beyond just taxes, one of the key tenets of the free market is free trade. The argument in favor of free trade was originally based on the work of British economist David Ricardo. He suggested that the world economy would work best if every country worked on things they had a comparative advantage in. So for example, if you're a poor country in the global south who isn't great at making microchips, don't bother. Just import them from Taiwan where they can do it quickly and cheaply. Instead, you can focus on agriculture and export bananas because other countries can't grow them as well as you can. The more modern theory behind this is called the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson, or the HOS theory. This focuses less on technology and more on factors of production. So countries that have cheap labor, like China or Vietnam, should do the labor-intensive work, while countries with a lot of capital, like the US or Canada, should focus on capital-intensive stuff. It makes perfect sense on paper, but doesn't necessarily work out in practice. As Chang points out, if a country institutes free trade and a bunch of steel mills close down, the machines used in the mill cannot just be converted into something that makes computers, and the workers can't immediately shift into working in tech without the appropriate training. Developing countries can be hit especially hard by free trade policies. Chang uses the example of his 11-year-old son. It doesn't make sense to launch this kid into the labor market to compete against adults. Instead, he should be protected, sent to school to learn, and only once he has the required skills to compete with his peers should he then enter the labor market as an adult. This analogy also tells us then that free trade can be good when the actors in question are ready for that competition. And when the strategy was implemented for developing countries, it actually worked quite well. After World War II, the developing world utilized protectionism to develop their industries, but after the debt crisis, they were forced to take on a more neoliberal approach, which failed to improve the state of things. Latin America in the 60s and 70s saw their per capita income growth grow at a rate of 3.1%. Between 1980 and 2009, after liberalizing their economies and removing protectionism, they grew at a rate of just 1.1%, with countries that rejected austerity and deregulation dragging up the average. Sub-Saharan Africa, on the other hand, grew at just 1.6% during the 60s and 70s, so one may think that shaking things up could improve matters. But from 1980 to 2009, their per capita income growth was just 0.2%. 1/8 of what it used to be. Chang points out that the growth rate for the developing world as a whole jumps to 2.6% from 1980 to 2009, but this can be attributed mostly to China and India. And although these countries did liberalize, they did not embrace free trade and austerity to the same degree that many other poor countries did at the behest of wealthy nations. Beyond slowing down the income growth in the developing world, relaxing regulations and allowing foreign capital to come and go as it pleases has led to an increase in economic crises in these countries as well. As Chang writes, this is because the global north has so much more money to throw around. Nigeria has the second largest stock market in sub-Saharan Africa, and it would need to increase 5,000-fold to match that of the United States. When capital controls were largely in place between 1945 and 1971, developing countries had no banking crises, 16 currency crises, and only one twin crisis, meaning both banking and currency crises at the same time. From 1973 to 1997, when global finance was liberalized, there were 17 banking crises, 57 currency crises, and 21 twin crises. Why am I telling you all this? Because when Dave tells you that classical liberal free market economics are good, he means they're good for rich countries. But this attempted free market system doesn't just filter wealth from the poor countries to the rich, it does the same thing within the rich countries themselves. There was a similar dynamic at play here historically. Rich people had always said that government regulation and redistribution was the devil, and it was very convincing, until the global economy collapsed in the early 20th century and the state finally stepped up to give people jobs and direct cash transfers to keep them afloat. Capital and labor established a historic compromise throughout many wealthy countries, and the period from 1950 to 1973 became known as the golden age of capitalism. The economy was growing, and both the rich and the poor were benefiting from it. But when things started to slow and stagflation hit, it was decided that the problem was labor and the government, and they needed to get out of capital's way. The result was income tax at the top was slashed, financial deregulation allowing for increased speculation, labor deregulation allowing companies to fire their staff more easily, environmental deregulation allowing them to pollute more, and, much like the third world, liberalizing trade. The result was that America's inequality shot up to the level of some Latin American countries. For reference, inequality in El Salvador was so bad that rich kids used to hunt poor kids for sport. But hey, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So if creating an economic environment that is more hospitable to the rich ultimately benefits the poor, maybe we can overlook this. The problem is that, just like in the third world, it didn't. Under the golden years, per capita income grew 2.6% every year in America, but between 1980 and 2009, it dropped to just 1.6%. The reason for this drop strikes at the heart of free market economics and the idea that market actors are rational. While the top 10% started to take 91% of the income growth between 1989 and 2006, and the top 1% took 59% of that growth, investment as a ratio of national output fell in America, as it did in pretty much all countries, both wealthy and developing. On top of this, while 2/3 of America's research and development was funded by the state during the golden era, the emergence of neoliberalism has seen this scaled back and the private sector has neglected to make up for the shortfall, meaning that the development of new technologies has declined. It's this and so much more that makes it such that Dave cannot make sense of anything he tries to talk about in this book, because the world did exactly what he wanted it to do 40 years ago, and it didn't fix anything. In fact, it has directly caused a lot of the problems he tries to handle now. He cannot decriminalize drugs in the way that a libertarian should, because in order for the Portuguese program to function, it requires taxation and an acknowledgement that the state can successfully implement social programs that benefit people. He cannot tackle the border in any meaningful way because he can't address the problems driving it on either side. He can't tell you that the influx of migrants from Central American countries has its origins in US-sponsored mass murder campaigns in places like Guatemala and El Salvador, and the subsequent US trade and drug war policies that helped to make Guatemalan children some of the most malnourished in the world. He can't say that many Mexican migrants are driven to the US because NAFTA completely annihilated entire sectors of their economy that couldn't compete with America and transferred massive amounts of wealth upwards. But he also can't recognize that America's agricultural industry is entirely dependent on undocumented migrants continuing to come through. He can't have an honest conversation about abortion because he can't talk about how overturning Roe has not decreased abortion at all, and that the movement to overturn it has been spearheaded by rich evangelicals who have funded a multi-decade campaign to take over America's judicial system. He can't talk about trans rights because he would need to talk about the government protecting them from things like workplace discrimination and family rejection. This would require workplace regulation and wealth redistribution to ensure that trans people can move out of unsafe environments without being in dire straits financially. He can't meaningfully engage with the wage gap because rectifying the unpaid labor associated with maternity leave and the associated pay cut that women take with it would require additional government regulation and wealth redistribution as well. He can't talk about the history of systemic racism because he would have to acknowledge that it is largely perpetuated through a class divide that would need to be rectified through universal government programs. He can't talk about American imperialism because the history of it tells us that free market capitalism is not necessarily the natural state of being. In many cases, the US had to intervene and violently impose free market policies on the world's poor, often to their detriment. And he can't talk about the success of the neoliberal movement because we're 40 years deep into that thing and people don't like the state of the world anymore. So instead, we get a book that is more interested in wokeness, SJWs, and the regressive left's culture war. It's a book that teaches us nothing about anything, and I can only describe it as a distraction from real issues. Which brings us back to Dave Rubin, the man. If he's so wrong about all this stuff, is it possible that he is just a grifter, that he's saying this stuff not because he believes it, but because someone paid him to? To close this out, I want to settle this thing. To understand how this book came to be and whether Dave is genuine, we need to understand who he is and how he got here. The best gateway into his mind are this book and this article from Quillette by Ross Anderson entitled All About Dave. I mentioned at the very beginning that Dave got his start as a stand-up comedian, and that his work there was truly horrible. And if you stuck around this long, I think you can stomach some more of that slop.
How many of you would say that you're conservatives? By a round of applause. How many conservatives? Conservatives always very respectful. You first raise your hand before you applaud. We don't make a lot of noise.
Donald Trump tweeted out a video about 25 minutes ago. He said, "We did a good fucking job."
The problem with Dave's comedy is that he seems to recognize the cadence of jokes and what they sound like without really cracking the code on what makes them funny. I think this book has a similar issue. He's heard a bunch of smart people make compelling arguments on his show, so he tries to reproduce them in this book without actually understanding any of the subject matter. For the same reason that this book didn't get the job done, his stand-up didn't either. Early in his career, Dave was working on a sketch comedy show with his friends where they would tear down one of the titans of the mainstream late-night scene, Jay Leno, and promise an alternative. Again, there is a very clear parallel here with Dave's politics. He promises something new and exciting, but it's just the same old shit, but worse. His career doesn't really kick off until he publicly comes out in 2006 and starts doing some shows on the gay scene before eventually pivoting to a radio show. The six-pack was pretty benign, and he and his co-host would use their platform to talk about current events and gay issues. A few years later, he would go on to work at the progressive Young Turks network. This gig is what allowed Dave to stake his claim as a lifelong lefty, which he has repeated endlessly throughout his career and restates in the first chapter of his book. But as Anderson points out, this original incarnation of the Rubin Report on TYT was not actually all that political. It was just a panel show where he would shoot the shit with his guests. The most popular videos he put out at the time were about condoms and Mia Khalifa. But regardless, him being there gave him some credibility as a man of the left. According to Dave's book, his turn to the right was spearheaded in part by comments that his boss, Cenk Uygur, had made towards black conservative David Webb, calling him an Uncle Tom. And this is fair to some extent. It's not a good look to call black people Uncle Toms because you don't like their politics. It's an L for Cenk, no doubt, but it probably shouldn't shake the foundation of your politics either. According to this book, it was this incident, Ben Affleck yelling at Sam Harris on Bill Maher, and the liberal response to the Charlie Hebdo shooting that made Dave decide that he was getting sick of the progressive left. But for what it's worth, his former peers at the Young Turks think that his intentions were much more about self-interest. Anna Kasparian would tell Anderson that Rubin spread rumors that the network was misogynistic against her, despite her being happy with her position and refusing offers to go elsewhere. She claimed that her refusal to leave for more money, quote, blew his mind. His new and improved Rubin Report would then explode in popularity once he started hosting popular right-wing talking heads like Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, and Jordan Peterson, and helped to launch the careers of many fellow disaffected liberals like Brett Weinstein. While Dave eventually conceded that he has become more conservative, for years he maintained his credentials as a lifelong lefty and that he had not changed, the world around him did. And the weird thing is, he's kind of right about part of this. Dave didn't change, because Dave Rubin was not a lifelong lefty. It's easy for him to say, because a gay comedian living in New York hosting a radio show before moving to LA to work on the Young Turks sounds like a very liberal career path. And I have no evidence to suggest that Dave ever voted for any Republicans before 2016. But voting isn't everything. You see, just like everyone else in the mid-2000s, Dave had a blog. And it wasn't good. You can see it's written in the same tone as this book. But it is revealing. On July 18th, 2006, he wrote a quick post saying, quote, "I think I'm going to stick with my new Republican leanings for a while. Want to fight about it?" The very next day, he criticized George W. Bush for his aversion to funding stem cell research. He ended the post by saying, quote, "I'm still Republican today, just one of the few who doesn't fear science." In his piece, Ross Anderson was able to dig up a few other interesting nuggets, including Dave's appreciation for Rudy Giuliani and Ron Paul in 2008. And this leads me to conclude something that I don't hear brought up enough. Dave is not pretending to be a conservative today. Dave was pretending to be a liberal before. This became clear to me while reading chapter 5 of Dave's book. In it, he tells a story about having black conservative Larry Elder on his show. And Elder just absolutely destroyed him in what Dave would consider another turning point in his journey rightward. And I have to say that watching the video of this is like watching a chimp smoke cigarettes. Like, they enjoy it, but you know it's bad for them in the long run.
What the fuck?
Is that not how everyone feels about it?
Keep going.
Dave tries to take the liberal stance that systemic racism exists, but when Elder asks him to name an example, he just draws a blank. Larry then lays out a bunch of stats indicating that black people have it pretty good, and Dave considers this an example of Elder's conservative facts winning out over Dave's liberal feelings. But that's not what this was. This was a battle between a conservative man who believed in his convictions and has spent decades doing research to back up his positions, and a guy who thought that hanging around liberals would just magically imbue him with an understanding of the world. But it didn't. So I believe that this shook him to his core and pushed him to the right. It was just for the wrong reasons. And I understand why people would look at all this stuff and think that Dave was just going through the motions and moving to the right at the request of his right-wing benefactors. But we actually know what Dave is like behind closed doors, and the man really does walk the walk. Anderson tells a story of Dave becoming extremely heated when a friend of his criticized Trump during a dinner. In a similar vein, the Tenet Media Indictment suggests that when Dave received a bio from the fictitious billionaire Edward Gregorian saying that he cared about, quote, social justice, he immediately took issue with it because he seemingly didn't want to work with a liberal. So by all accounts, it appears that Dave believes all the same things when the camera is off. But if that's the case, why does he feel like a grifter? Why do all of these people with politics similar to Dave feel like grifters? The online right does not feel genuine because although they are not lying to you about the world they want, they're lying about who it works for. Dave Rubin wants you to think that a world where we release the rich from the chains of taxation will be better for you. But it won't because the market can't solve any of the issues he tries to tackle in this book. Dave just doesn't know that because he never really checked. He just wants it because he's rich. The same goes for his peers. They want a world built in their image. Maybe they are grifters, but the thing they are lying to you about is not what they believe. The lie is that their worldview works for you too. To the extent that these guys have changed their opinions over the years, I don't think it's because foreign actors have paid them. It's because their own audiences did. Dave Rubin made a career off of platforming people like Milo Yiannopoulos and cultivated an audience of like-minded people. As they all continued to move right over the years, he went with them. It's one of the most blatant cases of audience capture I have ever seen, and Dave doesn't recognize that it happened to him. When Ross Anderson asked him if he ever worried about audience capture, he said it wasn't a concern for him because he was independently funded and no one has ever told him what to say on air. This demonstrated that Dave did not understand the concept at all. What he described was the exact situation in which someone becomes captured by their audience. Which brings me to the best place I can think to end this thing. Dave Rubin is not a smart guy. He was built to do a morning talk show where he sits down with a local celebrity and asks them softball questions. He makes tame, inoffensive jokes, and he becomes your mom's favorite comfort character until she finds out that he's gay. In an alternate universe, he ends up as Trump's sidekick on a Wendy Williams-style daytime talk show where they queen out Monday to Friday. But instead, Dave got caught up in politics, a world he was entirely unequipped for. He dined with the libs for years and thought he had absorbed a worldview from them. When Larry Elder brought him back down to earth, he was given a new path forward. He got to brand himself as anti-establishment while pushing the politics that would most benefit himself and his friends. But as his online community became more insular and he began to alienate himself from his peers at TYT, then Joe Rogan, and now people like Sam Harris, he's become more spite-driven and increasingly ignorant. And it was this ignorance that led him to write this book. Just like his time as a progressive, he thought that he could just take in conservative knowledge through osmosis and regurgitate it to great success. But he can't. The book sucks, and it's clearly written by an out-of-touch rich guy.
Hey, at least it was written by the out-of-touch rich guy this time.
I appreciate that, actually. He gets points for that. But in this book and beyond, Dave has doomed himself to an existence of constant humiliation. His own subreddit hates him. He can't face people on the other side of the aisle lest they ask him to debate Sam Cedar. He can't celebrate bringing children into the world with his husband through surrogacy without being viciously attacked by his conservative friends and their fans. He has taken up the mantle of big ideas despite having no ideas of his own. He lives in a prison of his own making, and I am almost tempted to ask you to have mercy on the guy for doing this to himself. But at the end of the day, that prison is worth $5.2 million with 6 bedrooms and 7.5 bathrooms. He built this luxurious prison by looking out for himself every step of the way, both in his personal life and in his politics. And if Dave's politics don't have any sympathy for the poor, then I don't think you should have any for him either. I would love to say something mean to Dave to cap this thing off, but there's nothing I can think of that could possibly be more hurtful than when his right-wing audience and friends refuse to accept him and his husband having kids through surrogacy. The most cutting thing I can come up with is that Dave is right. You should not burn this book. Not because it's good, but because it doesn't deserve it. There is nothing in here worth destroying or keeping from the world. It will never be important or relevant. It is just pure, unadulterated slop. Alright, anyway, that was supposed to be a fun 40-minute video where we laugh at Dave Rubin, but there was just so much awful stuff in this book that my anger and despair took over, and now we're here. So there's so much more that I could have said about this thing, but in hopes of keeping this thing under 3 hours, I had to stop here. If you want to hear me complain about Dave Rubin and the free market and some more, you can check out our Patreon where you can get your first month 50% off using the promo code BURNER. Next video coming soon. See you, nerds.